Okay, our next talk is by Professor Gloria Mark, and this is a talk I am actually quite interested in hearing more about. I just learned about it a couple of weeks ago, and for somebody with a maybe overactive mind with always the resources to find out any answers to any question in the world, it can be a little bit distracting. So I'd like to hear more.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm looking at a little bit different perspective than what's been talked about so far. So I'm looking at the behavioral aspect of IT use. And my starting point is that people are by nature monochronic. And what monochronic means is you want to work on one task through to completion before moving on to something else. That's the way I am, that's the way most people are. However, we have designed a world for ourselves with information technology that leads people to be polychronic, which means that people are switching between different tasks. And of course, it's a lot of things affect this, such as priorities and deadlines and so on, but that's the reality of the world we're in. So the basic research question that I've been asking is, how does this constant connection with digital activity affect our attention, our mood, our ability to focus, our stress, and what is our multitasking behavior? That refers to switching back and forth between different tasks. So to answer this question, I studied what I call technology in the wild. That means I don't bring people into a laboratory, but I actually bring all the equipment to the people, and they go about their daily work or social lives, and then I study what they're doing and how they're feeling. Two very basic groups of people that I look at are information workers, and I've been looking at people in a variety of different companies. What these companies share in common is that they're high tech, so people have access to a lot of different kinds of IT. The second group is Millennial Generation, particularly college students. Why are they of interest to you? Because these are the future information workers in our society. Now, in order to make sense of the data that I'm going to talk to you about, I need to tell you how I collect the data. And I use a variety of different kinds of sensors and biosensors to collect the data. Very briefly, what I used to do was ethnographic observation, where my students and I would go into the workplace, follow people, and with stopwatches, every time they changed an activity, we would click and time it, right? So you open up a Word document, start time, turn to your email, stop time for the Word, start time for the email. But now we use sensors to do that. So we log people's computer activity. We measure stress using heart rate monitors. This measures what's called heart rate variability, which is associated with stress. I've used portable galvanic skin response devices for stress. We have used what's called experience sampling. These are continual probes presented to people throughout the workday or in their the context of their regular lives if they're out of the workplace, and getting people to report on things like their mood, how engaged, how challenged they were in what they were doing. This device up here is called a SenseCam. It takes continual photos, and then we can run software facial detection on it so that we can see if people have interacted with someone or not. It's remarkably accurate. So now I'm going to first talk about data that we've collected based on information workers. And I assume everybody knows what I mean by information workers, people whose primary task is dealing with information. So, for example, not people in retail, right? Or not people who deal with things other than data primarily. So the first question is, how fragmented is people's attention? And this actually comes from earlier work that we did. This was before the sensors, using the stopwatches. And we find that people switch different activities on average about every 3 minutes. This is a very robust result. You know, we've done it in different companies. Sometimes it's 2 minutes and 59 seconds. But this is agnostic with respect to the kind of project. This is simply saying that, you know, looking at things like using your PCs, interacting with others, using email, and so on. So people switch. They spend about 3 minutes attention duration on any task before switching or being interrupted. And I should mention that the what makes 3 minutes as high as it is because interaction with other people is actually the longest component of this data. So, you know, then we asked, well, maybe it's not so bad to switch between Word documents, phone, email, if you're working on the same project, right? Maybe it doesn't matter. So what we did was we clustered the data with great labor into respective projects, what we call spheres of work, or working spheres. And so, you know, a working sphere could be, you know, I have a grant that I'm writing, or an academic paper, or a course that I'm teaching. So first we find that people worked in an average of about 12 different working spheres. That's about right for myself. I have about 12 different projects at the same time. And we find that people spend about 10.5 minutes on any project before switching to something else. So the 3 minutes has, you know, when we think in terms of projects, it's now become 10.5 minutes. That is still not a very long time. That is very, very rapid switching, and I claim that it's not long enough for people to get very deeply involved in their work. So given that you're interrupted, how long does it take people to resume work, to get back into work? And we looked at the data, and there's good news and bad news. And the good news is that if we look just on the same day, because it's really not fair if you know, someone is traveling the next day, or if it's a Friday and there's a weekend intervening, we just looked at the same day, work that was interrupted. We didn't look at the last hour. That's also not fair if a person gets interrupted at 4:30 and they're leaving at 5. So we found that 82% of interrupted work is resumed on the same day. That's pretty good, we thought. But the bad news is that it takes people an average of 23 minutes and 15 seconds to resume the interrupted work. If we think in terms of the working spheres, the 10.5 minutes that I talked about, what's happening? People are being interrupted, moving into another sphere of work, getting interrupted again into another sphere of work, and only then going back to the original project. So interruptions are nested. So let's talk a little bit more about interruptions. So there's 2 kinds of interruptions. You can be interrupted by a colleague, by email blinking icon, by a telephone call. These are external interruptions. But when we observe people, we find this amazing phenomenon that when I tell you, it will be very intuitive for you. People self-interrupt. So from the observer's perspective, someone's working on a Word document, suddenly stops in the middle of what they're doing and turns and makes a phone call, or turns and checks email. That's a self-interruption. And people self-interrupt nearly as often as they get interrupted from external sources. So we then looked at patterns of interruptions, and we find something really interesting. We find that when people experience patterns of high external interruptions, it's followed by patterns of high self-interruptions. So what this suggests to me is that people become habituated. You get into an interruption mode. When the external interruptions stop, people keep up that mode and they keep self-interrupting. Now, let's talk about email. So, people have always said that the main culprit for interruptions is email, right? So I wanted to see if we could create an environment where people could become more focused. And it took me 6 years to find an organization willing to let people be cut off from email for a work week, and I found it finally. We equipped people with, this time we're using sensors, we're logging their data. They wore heart rate monitors as a measure of stress. I like to use the analogy of email and zombies because, you know, with zombies, they keep coming and you keep killing them and they keep coming. And you keep killing them and the email keeps coming and you keep deleting it and it keeps coming. And you keep deleting it. So what we find is that when cut off from email, people were significantly less stressed, as measured by their the heart rate monitors, which are measuring stress. People focus significantly longer on any particular computer screen. People switched computer screens at a much lower frequency. It follows, right, from the duration. And what we find continually over and over again is when we ask people about moods, email puts people in a bad mood. That's what the data shows. Let's talk about gender and using the criteria of fewer self-interruptions and quicker resumption to interrupted work. How many of you think men are better than women at this type of multitasking? How many think women are better than men? How many of you think there's no difference? Okay, so the answer is women. The women in our sample, they were less likely to self-interrupt. They were more likely to resume interrupted work than men on the same day. They also report being happier in the workplace and they're more engaged in their work. So now I want to turn to more recent work where we're starting to look at attention in the workplace. So I'm very interested in looking at temporal patterns of attention and how this varies. We've looked at attention over the course of the day and over the course of the week, beginning and end of day. And let me just really quickly tell you a framework that we've been using. We have people who were continually probed and we ask them, how engaged were you in the thing you were just doing? How challenged were you in the thing you were just doing? When people report being highly challenged and highly engaged, we call this a state of focus. When people are highly engaged, but they're not at all challenged, we call this like rote work. It's like you're copying numbers down or you're playing solitaire. You're not challenged, but you're engaged in it. If you're not engaged and you're not challenged, we call it bored. But if you're challenged and you're not engaged, we call that frustrated. And in our sample, you know, we had thousands of responses, we only had 7 responses that fell in this frustrated quadrant. So we don't look at that data. Here's what rhythms of focus and boredom look like over the course of the day. So the black line is focus. And this is averaged over 32 people who were monitored for a 5-day period. What's interesting here, I think, is that people don't come to the workplace focused and ready to go. Focus peaks at 11 a.m. in the morning. It takes people time to ramp up and get focused. Then, of course, they break for lunch and focus peaks about 3 p.m. Boredom. People are more focused than bored in general in the workplace. Bored is the blue line. People are pretty bored when they start work at 9 a.m. It peaks again about 1 p.m. after lunch. And then road work, which is the purple line. It's a fairly continuous distribution over the course of the day. Let me talk about mood, and one of the things that we were very interested in comparing is online and offline interactions and what makes people happier. The primary type of online interaction that people at the workplace did is Facebook. So we contrasted Facebook with face-to-face interaction. So now let me ask you, at the time that the interaction occurs, how many of you think people are happier doing face-to-face interaction? How many of you think happier doing Facebook interaction? Okay. The answer is face-to-face. At the time of the interaction, face-to-face makes people happier. What about at the end of the day? And this is important because there's carryover effects, right? When people have a mood at the end of the day, they bring it home. How many of you think that the amount of face-to-face interaction that people had during the day makes them happiest at the end of the day? How many of you think the amount of Facebook interaction that people had makes them happiest at the end of the day? The answer is Facebook. And here's why I think it's going on. Because Facebook also correlates with being engaged in work. And if you're engaged in work, right, you don't want to have a face-to-face interaction because there's a social commitment, right? You're obligated to, participate in this interaction. Whereas Facebook is what we call grazing behavior, like cows grazing. You can go in and out really quickly. It offers a very quick break from work, and the user has control over their interactions in Facebook. Who you want to see, whose postings you want to see, and how long you want to be there. Okay, so now I want to switch gears for a little bit, and I want to talk about the future information workers, and this is the Millennial Generation. I love to collect pictures, and these are young seminarians I met in Rome. This is a Cambodian priest, and they're all young people, and they're all using information technology. The Millennial Generation is really a remarkable generation. It's the generation that grew up with the internet. It's the most connected generation, and it's also the largest generation in history. And these are the people who will be entering the workforce very soon. So one of the things that we have a very large ongoing study where we're tracking college students' all waking hours. And one of the things that we're interested in looking at is stress. And we find a very interesting positive correlation between the total amount of time people spend on a computer and the amount of stress. This is controlling for all possible stressors we could think of for college students, things like grade point average, course load, week in the academic quarter, and so on. Even after controlling for all that, we still find this positive relationship, but correlation does not imply causality. We can't say computer usage causes stress. Computer usage may be a reflection of stress. Now, comparing millennials with the information workers that I talked about earlier is a little bit like comparing apples and oranges, but I'm going to go ahead and make that comparison anyways. And we find that information workers spend about 1/3 less time in their attention duration on any computer screen compared to information workers. So where are we headed with this kind of research? So there's two directions. One is in terms of design. So the way IT is currently designed is that the burden is placed on the user to connect all this fragmented information that they have stored in different folders on different devices, and we have to think of ways that we can make a more cohesive kind of structure for users. So when they are interrupted, and this is not going to go away, multitasking doesn't go away, how can they recover faster? And then the last thing is interventions. We know that mood and stress are associated with different kinds of online activity, and I'm working with folks right now to see how we might be able to alleviate some of this stress. Next thing I'm working on is I'm going to do a very comprehensive study looking at health behaviors in relation to digital media use in the workplace. And I would like to thank the NSF. These are just some of the field site companies. Other ones prefer to remain anonymous. And of course, to the participants. Thank you.
We have time probably for just about one question. Lena.
What?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, they told you to.
In your studies, how did you factor for things like coffee breaks, lunch breaks, personal time to use the restroom, things like that, and all this? And did that count as part of the workday, or just?
Yes, the question is how do we account for breaks? So when we did ethnographic observation, we noted personal time. We excluded that from switching. When we're logging data, when people leave the computer, you have a screensaver that goes on. So we're not logging the time that people are away from their computer.
Right, just figured some downtime at some point.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Time for one person. I think back there.
Oh, yeah, I had a question. When did the data from the devices start as opposed to data from non-devices in your presentations?
So you're talking about the logging,
Yeah, well, in terms of logging, yeah.
the sensors?
Yeah, when did the sensors?
So when I started talking about the email cutoff, that's when we first started using sensors.
Okay.
And so the focus and boredom, that's all from sensors. And the Millennial Generation is from sensors as well.
Okay.
Let's thank our speaker, Professor Mark.